I don't know where you are at when it comes to the whole idea of riding a roller coaster. I will say that I'm not a fan. But I say that in the same vein that in my teens I rode roller coasters. I'm just making that confession to you now. It's something I didn't enjoy doing, but I did it, peer pressure and all of that. In my teens, as a Boy Scout troop, we would go to a place called Adventureland. It was in Iowa. They must have had a Boy Scout rally or something there. I truly don't remember why we went. But we went there every year, and we pitched our tent in the grassy parking lot outside of Adventureland, and then we'd, of course, we would go in and ride the rides. And one of the years that we went there, they had these brand new looping rides and up and down and all that kind of stuff, and did a whole bunch of circles, and I had no interest in that. But a group of us decided that we were going to try to see how many times we could ride this one ride that was basically abandoned by everybody because it was kind of a 1950s rickety, all wood. I mean, it was one of those kind of rides where you can, as you're riding it, you can hear it slowly degrading and deteriorating with every lap around. So it was kind of a bit of an adventure in and of itself. But beyond that, we wanted to ride that ride because nobody else was on it, and we wanted to see how many times can you ride this ride in one day. And I think we got to 14, 15 or something like that, because we would go up, and you get to the landing, and you get into the car, and as happens with every roller coaster, down came that bar. It slaps right down on your legs, and you're held in place. This was a really simple ride. It was just kind of an up and down, didn't even really go that high. It was high enough for me, but it was just enough to get enough speed to do a couple more, loop around. It took about, 30 seconds, and you're done. Whether or not you have ever been on a roller coaster, you know the bar. That safety bar, that supposedly OSHA-approved metal bar that falls down on your lap and keeps you in place no matter where you're going. Now, better rides today, the ones where even where you're being held in place and being launched or being thrown or being sent into the air or down into the ground, now they have some lap belts, or they might have a 5-point harness. Whatever it is that holds us in place in the midst of these rides that either we really enjoy or we really don't, I want us to invite us to keep that image in our minds, that we have this lap belt, we have this bar, we have this 5-point harness that is holding us in place, being held close to God as we read Revelation, because for the next few weeks, through the end of May, we are going to be reading and working through this letter, this book that I know some of us may not enjoy. We may not want to read Revelation. We may have fears and dreads about Revelation. I will tell you that in worship, we're only going to be really reading the fun parts, the worshipy, Jesus-y parts, but there are other parts. We know the other parts. There's authors across the continent who have made lots of money telling us about the other parts, the symbols, the dragons, the horns, the stars, the trumpets, the seals, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and all of that stuff. Some of that is in Revelation. Some of it actually isn't, but it's put in just to, I don't know why, but make Revelation sound even more interesting than it already is. But Revelation is a wild ride. Whether you've read it or not, whether you know much about it or not, it is a crazy experience to go through, in part because we don't know what all the symbols mean. It wasn't written for us. It was written 2,000 years ago for a completely different audience. Specifically, it was written for 7 churches. So it's one of those readings that we go to once in a while, and we're not quite sure why we're there. But as we go through Revelation, as we go through life itself, we remind ourselves that we are being held in place. That no matter how crazy the ride gets, God is with us. We are being held in faith and love. So as we enter into Revelation, we're in chapter 5 this week, so obviously there's 4 chapters that we're not reading. But I want to invite you to read all of Revelation, even if you need to read it in parts. One thing I want to let you know right away, it is not about the end of the world. Again, people across the continent have made lots of money telling us that it is about the end of the world, it's about these end times, it's about this moment that is coming when God will reclaim creation, and in doing that will destroy everything. That is not what Revelation is about. Revelation is about people who are being persecuted. It's about people who are being oppressed. It's about people who are being told that their lives don't matter because they don't have economic power, they don't have political power, they don't have civic power. They have to defend their lives, defend their livelihood, defend their identity. dare I say, defend their skin color and who they love and how they love. All of that was present even 2,000 years ago. But in the midst of that, because we humans do have a propensity for destruction, along comes war, and along comes threats of war, and along comes loss of life. That's what's happening in Revelation. Revelation is telling us about the lived experience of people, even today, who are told that their lives don't matter, and because their lives don't matter, life comes to an end. Fear rises. Desperation rises. Doubt rises. Disbelief in God rises because of what we humans will do to each other in the name of fear, in the name of power, in the name of presence. Revelation is written primarily for people who are suffering, people who are longing for hope, people even in this community, even today, who might be struggling with shelter, who might be struggling to get by, even if they're working 2-3 jobs, but don't have health insurance, or always dreading the idea that they might one day get sick or their kids get sick. It is about our people in this community, our people who we know, who are told that their lives are diminished, their dignity is taken. So it's quite possible that when we read Revelation, 1, we're not the primary audience, but 2, if we find that in our daily lives we have our struggles and we have our sufferings, we have our disappointment, but generally we are okay, we may not find ourselves connected with this reading. Revelation was written specifically for 7 churches. It was written to be read in worship. So we're only going to have like little snippets, little glimpses along the way. Chapter 5 this week, chapter 7 next week, chapter 21, chapter 22. Just little glimpses of the whole. But it was meant to be read in worship. It's meant to be a worship experience that we share in. And of the 7 churches that it was written to, some of them are suffering. So when you go through those first 4 chapters before you get to the one where we are at today in worship, you are going to hear about these different churches that are struggling because of economic disparity, struggling because the environment around them is being destroyed by the Roman government and by their oppressors. There is even climate change, global warming language in Revelation from 2,000 years ago. But there's also this one church, Laodicea. Now God is speaking through Revelation, through John, the author of Revelation, and speaking directly to these 7 churches and talking to you and me today. And Laodicea, one of the churches, God says to them, "You are neither hot nor cold, you are lukewarm. How I wish that you were hot or cold so that I knew where you stood." Which means even in that time, as some churches are suffering, if some of God's people are suffering and being persecuted and being denied life, there are others with the same faith, with the same connection to God, who aren't hearing the voices of the persecuted, who are not responding, who are not recognizing these voices of suffering in their midst. Revelation could be for us a conviction. It could be a challenge, because we are being called upon to hear the voices of those who are often not heard. The voices of those who are denied life, denied dignity, denied a place in our culture, our community, maybe even this church. So as we work our way through Revelation, and even today in this reading that we have, we hear about creatures, we hear about elders, we hear about angels, and then we have all these weird symbols that we don't quite understand. And some of it we will never understand because it was written for an audience 2,000 years ago. But here's what we know. That suffering that happened then continues today. Destruction that happened then continues today. Devastation that happened then continues today, because it's what we do. It's what we humans are good at. We are good at creating divisions, creating chasms, creating barriers between ourselves and our neighbors, between ourselves and people in our midst, between ourselves and people across the planet who we feel we have no connection to. It is a challenging text. This entire vision, and it's one vision, one revelation that goes from chapter 1 all the way to the very end. They're hard words. They're painful words. They connect us very deeply to the brokenness of this world, and they are inviting us to hear words and hear visions and hear ideas that we may not always see. And at the same time, Revelation is meant to remind us that we live in 2 realities simultaneously. There is here on earth the suffering, the destruction, the devastation, the barriers that are put between people who are black and brown and indigenous, people who have a different skin tone, a different ethnicity, a different ethnic background, maybe a different gender identity, a different way of loving and living in this world. All these barriers that we create as humans between age groups and between gender groups and between, well, you name it, we will find a way to create a wall. All of that existed then and all of that exists now. That is here on earth. At the same time, in the same breath, there is this ongoing worship that is happening in creation. Now, we talk about this in worship. We don't lift it up all that much because it kind of gets into the mystical realm. And let's face it, we Lutherans don't hang out in the mystical realm a whole lot. But we do confess it in the Apostles' Creed when we talk about the communion of the saints. We talk about how when we gather for worship week after week, when we gather around this table week after week, we are participating in an ongoing worship event. It never ends. Jesus is the one who feeds us at this table. It's the same meal that is fed to the disciples the night before his death on the cross. You and I are joining in an ongoing, never-ending, everlasting worship experience, and that's the bar across our laps. That's the seatbelt that holds us in as we are on this wild ride working our way through Revelation. We get these glimpses in chapter 5, chapter 7, and various points in Revelation. God wants us to know that as we are going through these moments of war and devastation and destruction, that at the same time, God is in charge. The revelation is not about war. The revelation is not about persecution because that already exists. We already have war in Ukraine. We already have a civil war in Ethiopia today. We have had wars across this planet. We have had devastation and destruction in this country. We have people who have lost their lives simply because of who God made them to be. All across this planet that already exists. That's not the revelation. The revelation is that in the midst of what we know, God is also in charge. God is claiming creation. God is at work in this creation. God is at work in this worship moment. God is at work in you. God's faithful, God's beloved. God transforms us. God is destroying death so that we can live, so our neighbors can live, so our coworkers, our classmates can live, so that we can recognize hope in this world. Revelation is meant to give us a glimpse that in the midst of suffering and disappointment and fear and betrayal and disappointment, in the midst, we can see God. We can know that God is at work, that God is moving, that God is breathing, that God is bringing life. That's the revelation. That's the unveiling. That's the great awakening that's happening in this letter, that in the midst of everything we know, God is here, that God is at work. That God is the one who has claimed us and loved us and transformed us and continues to move in our lives every single day. We humans, we know what we can do. We know what we've done. We know what we will probably continue to do every day of our lives walking across this planet because we as humans are prone to destruction. We find barriers and divisions and ways to cut each other off. It's what we do. What God does is continue to claim us and love us and transform us and draw us into this everlasting worship. Chapter 5 reminds us that as we are moving through this world, God has us. God is holding on to us, and God is holding on to the persecuted. God is holding on to the oppressed. God is declaring love and dignity for every person in our lives and in creation who is told that their life does not matter. God is at work. And so as we make our way through Revelation, we are given these glimpses. We're given these opportunities to leave this space looking for God, trusting that God is already there, giving us a vision and an awakening and understanding of God's movement in our lives and God's movement in this community. So that maybe we, at some point today, or maybe at some point this week, we can join in creation, in this ongoing worship, and we can find ourselves with great confidence and great work, great hope within ourselves, that we will stand in the midst, knowing God is with us, and God is with the oppressed and persecuted, and we will find the strength to say, Amen.